Des, thanks for sending through your article. I can't claim to have read it in great detail, I'm not going to lie. But the idea for the chat was the South African air pollution case, right?
Yeah.
Had you heard about that case before it kind of came into the news that they'd sort of won it? Like, was it something that you've been following for a while?
No, I mean, I have to say it came to me through the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre. So they're a charity that I've been doing some voluntary work with recently. I've been looking at air pollution legal cases and looking at whether kind of applicants have used human rights articles and arguments. And so really it was from the Business and Human Rights Resource Centre that sent it to me and alerted me to it.
And this idea of using, you obviously know much more about it than I do, but this idea of using a human rights angle or precedent to tackle air pollution is it that it's new? Is it that it just hasn't been done before? Like, what makes the South African case so groundbreaking?
Yeah, I mean, you know, from what I can see, it hasn't been used before. So human rights arguments. And I can see that, through looking at some of the cases, what's happened is lots of complainants. What they've done is they've tended to use other forms of law. So, for example, they've used maybe constitutional arguments, if they have a constitution, which South Africa has, or maybe they've used legal arguments in tort or environmental arguments. And even though they've used those arguments legally, what's happened is, because we're basically talking about someone's health being affected because of air pollution, ultimately, in some cases, we've seen some positive, enhancements to human rights, because health is a human right. And I guess that's what often people don't really think about.
Yeah.
Sometimes when people think about human rights, they think about individual rights, like my right to privacy or civil and political rights. And actually, there are economic and social rights that we have. They're just not really talked about in the news. So this South African case is groundbreaking. It's not just me that says it. For a few reasons, and I can walk you through that if you like.
Yeah, please do. I think it would be really. Yeah, I mean, I don't really, this idea of connecting the environmental movement with the concept of human rights, I feel that I've seen that play out in particularly, I suppose, Indigenous community kind of contexts, which is interesting. But I guess in the case of South Africa, we're seeing that have a broader applicability. Like, this isn't just it's not about one community or one disadvantaged group. It's like the right to live in a healthy environment is it's a universal human right.
Yeah. So what's really fascinating about this South African case is, they have a constitution. And so within it, Section 24 speaks to all citizens having a right to a clean and healthy environment. And that's what these community groups and environmental groups and lawyers did. Essentially, they used this Section 24 and said, South African government, you have not been looking after us. Essentially, you have not been... essentially, governments are duty bearers and they have a duty to protect their citizens. So what this group was essentially saying is that, you failed in that we've got air pollution that's significantly harming our health and you haven't been taking necessary actions. And so what this court decided in March 2022 is that they have a very valid case. So they essentially said, yes, as citizens, you have a right to a clean and healthy environment, and the government hasn't been acting, and therefore there's a breach of this right. So that's the first thing to mention. And then it went on and said, the government needs to take decisive action. And this, for me, is quite groundbreaking, because the courts essentially put the government on notice, and it said, you've got 6 months to develop some regulations that are stronger, that speak to kind of air pollution, and then you've got 12 months to ensure that they're implemented.
So the timeframes aren't actually, if you think about the consultation that's happening in the UK at the moment, what is it, like a reduction in the sort of limit of PM2.5 by 2040, and the South African government has been given 12 months to get its act together.
Exactly. And they went further, and they called out the Environment Minister. They called her by name, Barbara Creasy, and they said, you have to do this. And they actually mentioned in their court case that essentially she'd been dragging her feet. She'd
her
been
as an
in
individual,
effect,
they actually specified her role.
They specified her role. So very much groundbreaking stuff. And then also an important point is that they called on the responsibilities of business. So they said that, in the past, major polluters had kind of ignored or not considered it strongly, that there was this air quality management plan in place. And so this court, essentially the judge said, going, in the future, you need to consider the air quality management plan, and you need to start taking action. You need to start implementing actions to address the air pollution that you're causing. And that's quite significant because governments on the whole are very wary of getting industry to kind of clean up its act. So it's kind of taken that court just to say that.
And to really to tackle both, I completely agree. And particularly, the business angle is fascinating to say, you know what, you can no longer sort of pay lip service to this, essentially, under your corporate sustainability strategies. This isn't greenwashing. If we're holding people, organisations, institutions to account, then business absolutely is part of that. It's not just a bit player. I think is really, that seems really significant, even to someone like me who obviously doesn't really know much about the sector or the history. That does feel like a game changer, specifically in the South African context. I mean, what do you think are the chances of that happening elsewhere? I mean, in the UK, we don't have a written constitution, right? So it's different. But do you think, from your kind of, knowledge and connections of the human rights world, are other countries looking at this thinking, we should be taking the same approach?
Yeah, that's a great question. I mean, I would say, at the international level, there are lots of civil society actors, governments, lawyers, all calling for a general right to a clean and healthy environment. And so this year, potentially, this could be voted on at the UN General Assembly. And that's kind of being led by the UN Special Rapporteur on Human Rights and the Environment, a man called David Boyd. And so that, if that gets voted on favourably and that becomes a right at that UN General Assembly, at that international level, that will allow other governments around the world to say, we can include this as a right within our legislation. That will kind of give them the impetus. Some of them have already done that and they haven't needed that international kind of endorsement. But, others that are looking for that pathway, they can kind of look at that and think, this is something that we can do. And then from that, citizens will be able to use that hopefully to their advantage. So I think that's on the horizon.
Yeah. And I mean, is it? Yeah, I'm just. It's such a fascinating, I think, angle to take this connection between environment and human rights, and it's kind of your background, right? So in many ways, this is like a story that really speaks to sort of like your own personal, like, journey into the sector. But why do you think that it hasn't been connected before? This idea that why? I suppose I'm reflecting on it myself. Why this idea of health, I suppose, is considered as a medical issue. It's considered as public policy, like it's clearly a public and social policy issue. But you never really hear it spoken about in the context of a human right. I wonder how much that is to do with, and it's interesting to reflect on the case of South Africa. It's a new constitution, relatively speaking, obviously.
Exactly.
Only created in the last 30 years. So is it that traditionally these kind of health issues are considered perhaps, frankly, to be, the concern of lower income contexts, that, there are countries that struggle with issues to do with health, and that, that's where the kind of human rights connection come up. But there's almost like an assumption that in more developed countries that there isn't the need to enshrine it that clearly. I wonder how much that's a kind of an approach.
Yeah, these are great kind of philosophical questions. I mean, I guess what I would say is, if you're studying to be a doctor, if you're in the health sector, it's so intense already, and there's so much to learn, and probably, one could argue, is there time to start thinking about it from a human rights angle? And you probably just need more people that can join up the dots, I think, and back to your kind of earlier point about the environment and the human rights. And now we're starting to see people make connections between the two. But, as sectors, they're quite separate. They have different types of people in them, different skill sets. And traditionally, environmentalists are very much focused on the environment and not necessarily seen kind of how it's going to be impacting people. But climate change is changing that.
Yeah, I think that's the thing. So I was going to say, that's GAP's sweet spot, right? Is the connection between people and planet, and the fact that what is good for one is good for the other, and also what's bad for one is bad for the other. So that's clear, and that's an area that GAP has been working in for a while. But that's a fascinating reflection, that it's actually climate change. So the more that we're seeing, the more that, I guess, people are accepting that climate change is, and it's not a future thing, it's a real thing that's happening now. And I guess the more that it becomes clear that it's going to have really significant impacts on the way that we live our lives, that connection is becoming stronger. I suppose people are really understanding. Because that's what you're seeing at the moment, right? Countries that are on the front line of it. Yeah. This isn't just about, not that nature isn't important, obviously, but it isn't just about nature being affected by it. It's communities, it's coastal communities. It's there's this horrific heat wave in South Asia at the moment.
Yes,
it's gonna be affected. So do you think then? So should we be doing more? Should we be working more with human rights organisations? Is there appetite for that? I'm interested in this idea. There's just parallel. They're almost like two parallel worlds, the way that you describe them. Should we be doing more?
Yeah, I'd like us to do more, definitely. I just like in general there to be more appreciation of both perspectives.
Yeah.
Because I think that's what's key. And I like the fact that you talked about, what's going on in India right now with these heat waves. And I think, the fact that, us in the West, our media doesn't really talk about this. And so, climate change is still considered as, an issue for developing countries. And our media reinforces that. But, we live on one planet, don't we?
Yeah.
And we're all affected ultimately.
Yeah, I think it's so, having come from a very international background, these conversations are so live. You've got, particularly, for example, we used to work with universities in the Pacific and the Caribbean, and they just had a horrific cyclone season, just, islands completely, nearly destroyed. And this isn't, I think the two things for me are, this isn't something that's going to happen in the future. This is not some dystopian future thing that is going to be, 12 generations time, this is happening now.
Yeah.
And also that it's not actually, as you said, it's one planet, and it's not happening far away. These things have an impact on our shores. And I think that really speaks to this idea. I was struck by something Morgan kind of posted earlier in the week on LinkedIn about universalism, and just people just understand, even if you wanted to take a really parochial view and, say, well, in the UK, look at the kind of latitude we're at, it won't be that, we can live with a bit more flooding, so the coasts are roads, so what? The kind of people that get incredibly irate about refugees and, migrants coming over here, what do you think is going to happen when entire swathes of the planet become uninhabitable because of climate change? Where are people going to go? So even if, and as I said, I don't ascribe to that really parochial view, but if you want to take that parochial view, it's still going to come home to roost.
Yeah.
We still have a responsibility. You can't just sort of, the whole not in my backyard thing is just it's not going to work for something like this.
But it also affects us indirectly. So, what people are probably not realising is, England, India and Bangladesh, they produce large numbers of our bricks, for example. And so, if they are suffering from a heat wave, then they're not working. And if they're not working, they're not producing our bricks. And if they're not producing our bricks, then our houses are not going to be built. So, but people just don't think of that. So...
Yeah, I think that's the thing, I suppose, about globalisation, is it's made everything more interconnected. But I would say, generally speaking, we don't, in ways that we don't fully understand. We don't really appreciate how... I mean, I think you got a glimpse of that during the pandemic, didn't you? When the supply chains ground to a halt, then, nothing's coming through. We're not going to be receiving goods and sending goods. And, I don't know how much it's... And again, I suppose thinking more about the kind of the positive element of this, like the South African case is groundbreaking, and it's amazing to think of such kind of concrete action being called upon by
courts.
Exactly. Really holding individuals who have power to account, I think is incredible. And I think it's really inspirational for that sense, because as much as we're saying like it's not going to be in the future and it's not, it's going to be coming home to roost, it doesn't have to feel doom laden. There are definitely things that, well, obviously we should still be fighting for. And I think the South African case really inspires that. Do you know what's happened since? Because it was a couple of months ago, right?
Yeah, it was literally like 5 weeks ago. No,
okay,
I haven't. Yeah, let's give them time. But I know that climate change litigation, that's on the rise. And so, and watch this space when it comes to kind of air pollution litigation. I think, increasingly we're kind of seeing more victims, those who are harmed by air pollution, maybe their asthma or other health conditions have been worsened. They are starting to, issue some sort of lawsuits. And so we'll all have to watch this space, really.
Yeah. I think it is inspiration, actually, I think, to see people, to see citizens, individuals, and obviously them kind of working together collectively to realise their rights that are enshrined in law, and to actually turn around to people, organisations, institutions, businesses, and say, this is my essential human right, and you're contravening it, or you're not upholding it, or you're neglecting it, or whatever it might be. You have a responsibility to do that. And I don't know, I just feel, sort of, obviously the UN was created post-war, and this idea of human rights, and then I don't know if, there has been a period of time, you would know more than I do, where that has felt perhaps slightly kind of, it's a theoretical framework. And now, but it came from a place where the human rights were, that came from a place of need, of practical need, to ensure that these things were enshrined. And then I wonder if now, as we approach a period where perhaps there is going to be more, unfortunately, kind of, these practical needs don't come from a positive place necessarily, but again, they are a driver for people to really, that's why we need the human rights, I suppose. We don't necessarily need them when everything's great.
Yeah. I mean, I think we're seeing children assert themselves more than ever before. We're seeing a lot of kind of climate change litigation coming through because children are kind of clubbing together. There's a case in Portugal. Some children got together, pursued a lawsuit in Argentina. There was one in Australia. So I think that's exciting. You know, it's really exciting to see children kind of asserting themselves, understanding that they also have a voice.
Yeah.
And they should use it.
Yeah. And again, I couldn't agree more. Like, it's amazing to see. The only thing I would say is that I would never want that to feel like, therefore, the kind of current generations can abdicate their responsibility on that, and sort of just say, well, you know, the kids have got it covered, aren't they great? They're so young and full of energy, and, you know, it's really their future. It's like, yeah, but, you know, while we're still here, like, we have a responsibility to fix this. And I just wonder how, you know, again, I think the power of citizens, it's really amazing to see what can be done when people really not just speak up, I suppose, but really sort of recognise that there are tools in place to actually do something like proactive with that. And we don't always necessarily think of it. Like, I think you can think of being a citizen as quite a passive thing.
Yeah.
Oh, well, maybe I go and vote every now and then, and I have to pay taxes, and okay, there are some laws that I have to follow, but actually it works both ways. Yeah. And
on that note, we should probably wrap this up and go and vote.
Oh yeah, I know.